Happy New Year. Happy Year of the Tiger.
Oh, no, grr.
Yeah.
Do tigers go grr? I don't know what tigers do. They go grr.
Yeah, somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere
somewhere
like
around in there. Yeah. How was your break?
It was good. We had a very interesting one, and we might as well launch into this and start talking about Omicron, because I think I figured out that I'm genetically immune to it.
Oh.
And I will explain this to you. Obviously, that's bold, but I'm going to go with it anyway.
Yeah, I like it.
So we went skiing.
Okay.
And we went out to Utah, where we hadn't been for like years and years and years. And the entire skiing industry has been basically bought up by private equity and consolidated in large blocks. And the walk-up rate is now $212 if you want to just ski for a day. So you have to buy passes months in advance and then commit to this series of resorts. It's just the consolidation of everything. Like, there's 4 airlines. There's 3 internet suppliers. There's 2 ski passes for the whole country. It's awful, right? So anyway,
wait, if I just hang on to do the math. So if I was skiing for a week, can I buy, like, I can buy a pass, or I have to pay, like, if I ski in 7 days, I'd have to pay like $1,500?
So here, say for example, we fell for it and we bought the passes up front in October, like the year before or whenever it is, like. Okay. And we were like, yeah, we got them. We got them for $1,000 each, right? And then we say, Carrie, we've got free accommodation. Why don't you come with us? And then when you walk up and say, I'd like to ski with these guys for like 3 days, they'd be like, that'd be $600.
Holy cow.
Yeah, it's horrible. Anyway, we can get back to that if we want to talk about that. The real reason I mentioned this is so we went out and we did it, right? And the skiing was great for the first 2 days, and then there was a huge snow dump. And it was a big snow dump, and they needed it. It was fine. So we had to go from this one ski resort to another ski resort on a bus. So you know those big bendy buses, the ones that bend in the middle?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So there's so much snow falling, and basically Park City, that's where I was, has become one of the places in the pandemic that every rich idiot in the world moved to, which means there's permanent gridlock and no parking at the best of times. With the snow falling, a 10-minute journey took 50 minutes. There must have been 100 skiers on the bus, all pretending to socially distance by being like sardines in a can and pretending to wear masks, right? So we're all on this bus and I'm like, okay, that's it. We've all got it. Just stand by, right? And then we flew back home, came home, got PCR test. None of us had it.
Wow.
I know. And yet almost everybody else I know has been Omicroned. So it just goes to show you how random.
Scottish genes,
Well, like Klingon genes, basically. That's what it is. So there we are. So anyway, here's my point about this, right? So are we still freaking out about COVID, or are the only people that care leader writers for the New York Times and other East Coast elites? Because when I was out in Utah, it didn't really seem as if the people of Utah were giving that much of a crap.
No, I think, I'm using myself as the example here because I feel like, I still am like, I fight with myself, like when I wear the mask at the grocery store, because I'm like, don't I believe in the science and do I need to, all that stuff. And so I just like reached my limit on this thing. So I feel like if I'm close to this, like, and I look around and the restaurants are packed, I'm way behind the curve and everyone's over it. Yeah.
So this whole thing of the government sending everybody out rapid tests, is there a danger that basically signals to everybody, oh God, they're still at it. What a waste of money.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because Biden did this press conference, and we'll talk about, the legislative setbacks that he's had. But you felt like in some ways during the press conference, he had to announce the the test, sending it to everybody and the masks and all this sort of stuff as a way to say, I'm still doing this. I'm still we're still doing something about COVID. So don't blame me for it because I know you want to blame me for it. And so it was like this defensive mechanism.
But it's just a weird thing to do. It's kind of like, you're really annoyed with your 4th grade teacher because she wants you to do long division all the time. And you've moved on to a new class, and then the same teacher's following you around going, I'm still making you do division. You're like, where is this going? I'm not sure that's sort of I don't think anybody's going, well, I was skeptical about Biden, but now that he's going to send me tests I'm not going to use and masks I'm going to totally ignore, I've converted. Is this sort of just massive democratic mismessaging again?
Well, I'm probably on that. I mean, I guess it was interesting. It's interesting to look at the poll numbers. I mean, part of this is like, right, he comes into office and he's going to be the great savior of COVID. And so, the approval of his job in COVID is really, really high. And now it's just so it was like 70 when he comes into office, 70% approval. And now it's like 44%. But you just Americans are so fickle too. And so I guess they're just gambling to say, it shows that we're doing something versus doing nothing, because it turns out you can't really do anything with the disease or with a virus that has a mind of its own. But, I guess they're just trying to look like they're trying to save their legislative selves in some way. It feels like a lot of hand waving.
Before we go back on to Biden, here in Rhode Island, of course, we've been dealing with the quote-unquote total collapse of the health system.
Yes.
And what's really fascinating about that isn't the number of cases ending up in the ICU. It's the fact that after 2 years of being treated like shit, loads and loads of healthcare workers who work for a monopoly employer, which is what we have in the state healthcare system, who are getting paid $18 an hour for doing difficult, dangerous stuff, said, I'm done. I can get 16 at McDonald's. I don't need this crap anymore. So they have a huge labour shortage, which is what's really, causing the problems in the healthcare sector. Yet we still get this messaging, which is essentially it's this terrible virus and it's going to put hundreds of thousands of people in the hospital. And it's like, that doesn't really seem to gel with what we see on the ground.
Well, and this is your point about ski resorts, right? The hospitals have consolidated and there's a profit-driven business, and that when a Q-tip costs $58 in the hospital, I mean, all of these different forces coming together to then combine into the nurses and everyone else saying, like, this is too much after 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where we are, and that's just our usual happy space. Let's think more about Biden. So Build Back Better. Whatever happened to that one?
Yeah, so it's tough right now for the Biden administration. You kind of you feel bad for them mostly because I think they were riding pretty high in the first year, feeling like they got some stuff done, and now it looks like a Build Back Better. I really wish that they talked about your point about messaging or bad messaging, that they named it something different, but that's going to have to be cut up, like in a chop shop in order to get that thing passed. Voting rights. I mean, last week or this week, I can't remember which week, it was not good in the Senate. I mean, the senator from Arizona said, essentially Biden says, I'm for breaking the filibuster. We can move forward, and we're going to move forward, simple majority on this. And Kristen Sinema said, I can't support that. So voting rights, the Biden administration is smart to move forward on it, to make people vote against it. But that was awful.
Yeah, it just seems to be loads of Pyrrhic victories every single time. It's like, all you need to do is bribe Uncle Joe enough and he'll fold. No, he won't. Oh, we can do voting rights because you really have to be on the wrong side of history to go against that one. No, you don't. You can defend the filibuster. It's indefensible. Watch us do it. They just seem to just never quite get the strategy right.
Yes, I agree with that. Though the one saving grace I will say is that it's January right now, and a week is like a year in the political world, so that everyone that's crying about the midterms, including myself, there's still a long way to go when it comes to that. But one of the interesting things, here's my transition, is that Republicans are just the party of no right now. But I actually think you start to see some crumbling right now with Trump. There's the spat between Trump and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. And also the Supreme Court has said that Trump can't use executive privilege for some of this January 6th stuff. And then this interesting NBC poll came out, and, polls, whatever, but it does show that the support of Trump by Republicans is the lowest it's been since 2019. So I do wonder if the Trump support is really starting to wane.
But there's another way that this could play out. What was the name of the guy who was going to do the report to Congress that was going to show Trump was all this criminal Russia, blah, 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 blah. And he delivered a big report to Congress and it amounted to nothing. What was his name again?
Mueller. Yeah.
Is there a kind of Mueller Jeopardy clause hanging over this? That, like, once again, we have the January 6th investigations are moving forward, and this person's talking, and this person's talking. And at the end of it, they'll do a report that'll be totally anodyne that says, a businessman from Queens inflated the value of his assets so he could get better terms on a loan. Like, that's really never been done before. Every single person who remortgages their house tries to do that.
I'm laughing because I was reading an article about January 6th and I stopped midway through because I got bored and I was like, just give me the bottom line here, people.
Yeah, and the bottom line might be he survives and then his numbers go back up again. So there we go. We'll find out soon enough. All right, so give me something hopeful that I don't know anything about. Ranked choice voting in Alaska. If this is the bar for hope, it has fallen to new lows. But let's go for it.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do this so you don't fall asleep. So Alaska Supreme Court upheld the ranked choice voting. It'll be the second state after Maine to do ranked choice voting. And ranked choice is super straightforward in that you rank your top 5 candidates for office, mayor, whatever, what have you, statewide elections in Maine.
What if you don't have 5 candidates for a job?
Yeah, that's the problem, is that Americans were not super great on the whole civic education thing. So, I mean, I was reading some academic papers about this. And of course, the big problem is that people don't fill out their entire ballots because, I mean, we barely know like Joe Biden's name or that Obama was born in the United States because we know that Hawaii is an American state. So I don't know how we're going to know about like 5, be able to rank 5 different candidates for this.
So what's it meant to do, right? Why is this a good thing? Why is this something worth doing?
Yeah, I mean, it breaks the 2-party rule, right? Because then other parties come through, or it allows for maybe more moderate candidates to get some oxygen versus the really strong Democrats or Republicans on either side. Or on the other side, there was some research having to do with European countries that allows extremist parties to then be part of it and maybe vent some of that frustration. That to me, I needed to understand a little bit better.
So if we take a long-term perspective on this, the primary system was invented after 1968 to solve the problem of oligarchy in the parties by giving thorough democratic reforms. It became so democratic that it was captured only by activists whose preferences do not represent anybody except the most extreme. So now we're banking on another electoral reform to save ourselves from the last electoral reform. Is that pretty much it?
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. Awesome.
Yep, that's exactly right. So it's interesting though to see it done in cities. Here's the thing that I was really curious about is that does it actually change the outcomes of election? Like, do researchers see that it would have changed the outcome of election? And that is unclear. I mean, the research that I read, at least, is that, people not filling out all their ballots, and that you might see a few more people voting. So unclear at this point.
Wouldn't it be ironic if we went through all this and it turned out that everyone was just as extreme as the people that you think are the extremists? Like, it didn't really change anything. It's just like everybody I'm still a complete nut job. Ah!
Right. I know a favorite topic of yours, inflation. I felt like we had to talk about this only because I'm scared of it now. And I'm curious whether you think this is something real or whether this is just like the front page of the Washington Post.
So it's definitely a real thing, right? And the really interesting thing, beyond the transitory, right? And we've spoken about that before, right? How long is a transitory period? But the really interesting thing is what's the drivers behind this? Because that's what tells you what to do with it. And on that, there is no consensus whatsoever. So in the past week, I read a summary of research by Adam Tooze through his newsletter, chart book, that basically makes the case for its, team transitory. The signals are there it's falling. Martin Sandbu at the Financial Times did another really good piece. If you look at monthly changes versus year-on-year changes, then you get a very different picture, right? And the key thing is, all of this is based upon, if you will, kind of economic prejudices. Right, so, it's the stimulus checks. You gave people all that extra money. Well, it wasn't extra money, it was income replacement. And when you divide it across the whole population, it's not enough to cause a symmetric inflation across all sectors. That's just not it, right? And most money is bank money, credit money. It's not actually central bank money, so we'll just put all that down. But people really want to believe that story. So, it's the stimulus. It was what Biden did, right? So you're never going to get past that, right? Certain people are going to believe that. They're primed for that message in a sense. Then you get the more interesting stuff about, well, is it wages? Well, wages are definitely going up at the bottom for the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
There's tight labour supply, all the rest of it. Right, but is that filtering through into hurting profits? Because that would be the mechanism whereby wages squeeze profits. Profits then get pushed onto price increases to protect profits. Corporate profits have never been higher. So it's highly unlikely that's it. So is it then price gouging? Well, I would say it would be, given the fact it's $200 a day for skiing, and every single sector in the United States has basically been bought up and consolidated by private equity and large firms. So I think there's a great deal of things that could be true in that space. But again, there's a very big resistance to this one. And this came up when a young economist called Isabel Weber, who's at University of Massachusetts Amherst, wrote a piece in The Guardian, similar to the type of stuff that I do, 1,000 words. It's not exactly nuanced. And she says, people are looking at the 1970s. Maybe you should look at the post-war period. Some people have already made that argument. And what that really is a lot of shifting over of areas of the economy from, defense production to war fighting to civilian, whatever, transitions costs. And also what they did at that time and during the war as well, they had lots of price controls. And, if it is basically just firms taking opportunity of shortages to ramp up profits, maybe we should think about that. And that's it. Twitterverse exploded, right? I mean, it was insane. There's a kind of thing about the economics community, particularly in the US, that the 1970s is a kind of contested history. And how you think about the 70s, right, really determines a lot of stories you tell yourself afterwards. And one of the settled stories is that Nixon did price controls. They were a disaster. Price controls never work. They're a disaster. Anybody who advocates for price controls needs their head examined. And it was really vicious what happened to her. Very serious people, Paul Krugman, for example, actually had to apologize afterwards for the way he just went mental on this. And I thought it was really interesting how there's a kind of psychological trauma involved here for many people. Again, there are people who will never not believe the story that it's all money. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of people who have a particular view of the 1970s, and anything that uncorks that or opens that up, it's just completely beyond the pale. You're not allowed to do that. So to me, to get back to your fundamental question, the inflation is there in the sense that prices are going up in very simple terms. Well, there's no consensus on what's causing it. And the very fact of identifying causes is an intensely political act. Yeah. Because when you do that, you're saying, this is what's to blame, therefore this is what we should do. And if it is the case that, it's supply shortages, it's kind of coming out of COVID but then stopping again, it's spending less on services and more on goods at a time when goods are backed up. If you put up interest rates, it's not going to do anything. It's not about altering inflation expectations or any of that stuff. But that seems to be the blunt instrument that everybody wants to use. Why do they want to do that? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because it would increase your margins in some way in finance, There's other ways to think about it. But point is, nobody knows anything other than the fact that it's real.
Well, I have a question about price control. Elementary, is it price control exactly as it sounds? The government says to Jeff Bezos, you can only sell your pencils for $1?
Yeah, absolutely. But if you think about, the difference between Nixon trying to control the price of pork, which led, for example, butchers to basically shove pork out the back door to restaurants on side deals, right? Versus that you've got a firm, let's take, for example, Amazon, or let's take any of the digital giants, that have monopoly profits, that have unbelievable profit margins because the marginal cost of production is zero. Let's take your local favourite crappy internet firm where you're lucky if you get a choice of two in your city. And they've been charging you for the past 10 years literally 50 to 60 times more than any other developed country. Well, and suddenly they're pushing up prices. Well, I'm sorry, what has COVID or supply shocks or any of that got to do with the fact that you're shoving that price up?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So maybe, for example, we should be looking at those sources, not just of inflation, but in a question of fairness. We used to have a Justice Department that would go after trusts and other economic entities that were price gouging. And we, rather than thinking that that's kind of something that the state should do, we now go absolutely mental when somebody even mentions the prospect, which is very, very strange.
Your point about the 70s is so right on because, of course, so much of the stuff is that Biden is Jimmy Carter. And I saw one piece that said he should be so lucky if he's Jimmy Carter because Carter only lost like a very small number of seats in the midterms, blah, 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 and, Biden's going to lose everything and blah, blah, blah. So the 70s is even to say it and people just start, breaking out in hives. So you're so right about the 70s narrative.
Oh, and it's so weird because it depends exactly on what metric you choose. And the funny thing about inflation is it's a metric, it's a measurement. And what you put in the measurement and how you calculate it and all that sort of stuff really determines what comes out. And one little stat on the 1970s, you go back to the 1970s, truck drivers, who we've had a shortage of for 10 years, in real terms got paid a third more in the 70s than they do today. Yeah. So was the 70s so awful for them? Yet we have this kind of meta-narrative of it was the worst of times, and if we didn't do all the terrible things we did, like jacking up interest rates to 20%, et cetera, then God knows where we'd be today. And it's sort of like, really?
Yeah.
Might be a bit overstated.
On, terrible times. We talked about this last podcast about Russia and Ukraine, and it's still, it's really heated up over the last few days. What is your take on what Russia's positioning is, and what is the real issue?
Well, as we said last time, their shtick on it is essentially back in the day when we gave up the old empire. You made a promise to Gorbachev, verbally, Jim Baker, that you wouldn't expand NATO. Since then, 12, maybe more countries have joined, all of the ones that were in the old Warsaw Pact. And not content with that, you also brought in the Baltics. You've actively promoted democracy, i.e. made unstable all of the border states around us, Georgia, Azerbaijan, etc., etc. You brought the Baltics in, you made them NATO members, you give them F-16s to annoy us, etc. And now you're doing the same thing with Ukraine, which literally puts NATO on our doorstep. Now you have this thing where you keep saying that it's not an anti-Russian alliance. What else could it be? I mean, you only expand one way and it stops with us. So their playbook since Georgia in 2008 has been, you can't join, let me get this straight, you can't join NATO if you have contested borders, right? Watch me contest your borders.
Yeah.
So that's it. So they're not going to allow Ukraine to join NATO. Now, of course, we're taking the high road on this because talk is cheap. Because on the one hand, we're saying, well, we can't tell a sovereign nation it can't join. Of course it's allowed to. And, all the foreign ministers of NATO have affirmed that there's the right of every sovereign to make this decision. Yeah. Meanwhile, you've got the Germans vetoing the Brits flying planes over Germany with weapons for Ukraine. They're completely hamstrung because their entire heating bill for the winter depends upon Russian gas exports, right? The Poles are caught in the middle of this going, told you so, right? The whole thing's a total mess. And one thing we know is that the United States is not going to go to war over Ukraine. It's simply not going to happen. Yeah. So, and they will not give them the guarantees they want. And they've upped their ante on the guarantees. They want like Bulgaria to withdraw from the alliance and all this. Never going to happen, right? So they will do it. I think it's just a question of time. I think that they will invade. It's not clear where they stop. I mean, actually going to Kiev, occupying, putting in a puppet government, massive civil repression, hundreds of thousands of deaths. I'm not sure they're really up for that because in the long term, I'm not sure they can hold it. But if the game is simply keep disputing the borders because that way you can't join NATO, they can do that from now to 1,000 Christmases.
Well, but right now they certainly have a lot of leverage on Europe because it's cold. Do they have the same leverage in the summer? I mean, do they have a small window of time to actually act on their threats? I mean, I think that the seasonality of this is what is interesting to me.
Well, the other one, it's not as if the Germans are actually going to turn around the other way in the summer and go, oh, now we really are going to back you. And, that's not it. I read something recently this week where someone said a sort of phrase at the German foreign ministry is, our nearest neighbour is Poland and the nearest city is Moscow.
Oh, jeez.
So they're not looking west, they're looking east.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the other thing, it's not just heating. I mean, what does Germany make? They make lots of things with steel. How do you make steel? You burn gas. Yeah. You do that in the summer as well.
Well, and the Kazakhstan thing as well, which I kind of understand, is also playing out. So you get the sense, that getting the band back together again, that that Russia, I mean, Kazakhstan is in disarray over fuel prices. And so who do they call in? But they call in the Russians. I mean, all of these different pieces sort of, floating around, and like, what does it add up to?
Well, it seems to just be playing their way. I mean, you have this big strategic realignment between China and Russia, both who have an interest in basically no longer relying on the dollar for clearance of their transactions and essentially getting freedom away, getting away from control of the United States, etc. And then you also have these peripheral regimes that were very high on sort of, redistributing down until the cronies that run them discovered it's much more fun to redistribute up. Yep. And eventually that becomes fragile. They fall over and then they call in the Russians for support, at which point the Russians are like, we're back. So, Belarus went that way. Kazakhstan's gone that way. It's, it's less getting the band back together than sort of like drunk band members stagger through the door of the van and de facto the band is back together again.
You forget that in the 90s under Yeltsin, there was a moment like the Scorpions, winds of change, right? Like democracy was spreading and like Russia could have been brought in, and that didn't happen. Yeah,
no, they absolutely didn't. And, from the Russian point of view, instead of which they followed American economic advice and 40% of GDP disappeared in 5 years. They created a class of oligarchs that stole the state that were only tamed by Putin. And they've had a modicum of stability and growth since that point in time under his regime, which is why they keep voting for him.
Yep.
So, the local on the ground view is very, very different from the chattering classes in the West talking about it.
Chattering class who owns their penthouse in Manhattan. Yeah.
Exactly.
Speaking of chattering class, so Boris, who I read in the paper, he goes by, his friends call him Al, but in any case, seems to be on the ropes. And that, he had these parties, so he had parties last spring when the UK was on lockdown. Right. And there's the picture of the Queen mourning Prince Philip all by herself, where Boris or his people, someone had some sort of get together in a garden. He thought it was work, but it was really a party and bring your own alcohol. And I guess he didn't know what the rules were, even though he sent it. And now you have the hyphenated fancy members of parliament denouncing him and saying he's got to go. And they quoted Oliver Cromwell, which to an American sounds very highfalutin. So, from from total external, it looks like he's on the ropes.
Yeah, he's on the ropes. So the question is, when you knock him out, who do you replace him with?
Well, the Chancellor of the Exchequer seems to be the...
Right, but the right wing of the party think he's a closet socialist.
Oh.
I see. Sunak's been spending all that money. Where are our tax cuts, goddammit, right? We voted for Brexit to get away from Europe, not to wheedle our way back in. So the thing about the Tory party is they're very split. And the thing about Boris is because he's such a cipher... this is a man who, as a journalist, wrote 2 essays on Brexit. One, why we shouldn't do it, and one, how we should do it. Right? And then just basically went with the let's do it one, and the rest is history. And he has this weird ability not to unite the party, but to straddle both camps. Right? And in a sense, keep them together, weirdly. In part because, well, what's your alternative? You're not going to go down the Theresa May route again and get someone who's sort of, a very technocratic leader. That's not what the problem you need to solve is. And the other big problem they have is, they talk a good game of levelling up the country and all the rest of it, but they've actually done nothing. In part because of COVID, right? Nobody's great on transformation just now, pace, take back better, etc., etc. Take back better, build back better. Take back better. That's the Republican version. Is take back better. We're just going to take it back better. Anyway, where was I with Boris? So they don't really have any kind of real set of plans for the country. And in a way, the sort of, rich boys getting together to win parliamentary seats, to get drunk in the garden at Downing Street and call it a jolly while the city of London continues to turn out cash, that for many of them is a good result. So,
But interesting, Blyth, is that Labour doesn't really have an answer either, right? Because if they had somebody, then Boris might actually be running for his political life. But Labour doesn't really have an answer, right?
Well,
they've got Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer, right? The guy who sounds strangely like a German war comic. You know,
Serious.
but it's a bit. There was a brilliant line on the British News Quiz this weekend. I laughed so hard and like crashed the car. As one of the commentators on there said, Boris has been describing what was obviously a party in Downing Street Garden in the summer with tons of booze as a work meeting, and I can imagine that a work meeting with Boris basically is a party with tons of booze, whereas I can imagine a party with tons of booze with Keir Starmer is actually a work meeting. And I think that kind of really sums up the way that people feel about these people, and that's in a sense why Boris gets so much slack. And at the same time, there just seems to be no way for Starmer to, to grab onto him. He's very Teflon in that way.
Right. Well, I was struggling to find something lighter to talk to,
we always are. We increasingly are. Let's go. What was it? Was John, our engineer, was saying at the start of this? Is like, well, we're living through the 6th great extinction.
Yes.
Where scientists have just said that we just busted through planetary boundaries on toxic chemicals. What else is going on now? Oh, a great one I read today. This is brilliant. There's now more plastic in the environment than there is biological organisms.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I know. It's just
incredible.
So what's your up? Give me your upside.
Just to add on to that, the volcano eruption in Tonga, I don't know if you saw that, but it was from space. It was like you could see it from space too. Anyway, my lighter material was, and is really in quotes, is just how dumb is Prince Andrew. I mean, we have like someone who allegedly assaults young women. But I was reading about him from the very trusted news source called The Sun.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess he collects teddy bears, and one of his maid's duties or housekeeper's duty was to arrange the teddy bears in certain patterns at the end of the day. There's a lot going on with the Prince.
Well, this is the downside, if there is an upside, of having a hereditary monarchy, right? Because, you can have people who do that for you.
Yes.
Because that's who you are, right? You're a prince, you collect teddy bears. I guess we have some underling who's chief teddy bear sorter. Right?
Yes,
and but the problem is the whole Epstein thing is pretty straightforward. Ultimately, it's really hard for the royals to monetize their brand, but they all have very expensive lifestyles, and particularly Andrew and his ex, and they got in a hole and they took a loan from a bad guy, and it all started from there. It's really straightforward. What else happened? Oh yeah, Djokovic. What do you think about that one?
Oh my Lord! So I watched this because, first of all, I need to be clear here because I have a bias because I'm a Nadal fan. And so therefore I'm not a big fan of Djokovic. But I thought about it, and I was like, okay, here's someone who's not vaccinated. And he just looks like a doofus. I mean, he actually lied that he lied, that he didn't know he had COVID. And then he went and talked to like little kids in hospital, like this kind of stuff. But then I was reading like sort of more serious articles about it. And, the Serbian Nationalist Party is starting to gain steam. And so I wondered, like, does he now become like the Serbian nationalists, like, hold him up on a pedestal because he like stood up to the Australian government? It has all these like political implications. And I just thought, I don't know, he just kind of looks like a doofus. But then not seeing these other, like, the larger political picture.
So to me, the interesting part of this was what the Australians did. I mean, again, it was like the confidence and subtlety you would expect from the government of Australia. So you let them in, despite the fact that you won't let your own people in because they've been stranded abroad forever. You won't let your own people out because you might not let them back in again. But, tennis players, film stars, whatever, they can all come and go. So you let him in, even though he lied. Then you say, well, I'll probably be all right. Then you reverse yourself. No, it's probably going to be bad. Then you go, no, he's definitely got to go out. And then he finally goes out. And you're just like, what was that for? And, why do you have this 2 tiers anyway? I mean, my nephew finally got back to New Zealand 2 weeks ago. And he still had to spend 10 days in a hotel. He was triple vaxxed. Nothing wrong with him. Do a PCR test. And he won a lottery to get on a flight that went through bloody Fiji to get home. Yeah, I know.
No
it's totally
way.
And then it's sort of like, well, you're a big tennis player. Why don't you come in then? You haven't been vaxxed. Never mind, mate. It's all a bit of a laugh. It's just another example of people just obviously having good reason for having no confidence in government.
Well, right, and it's the Boris thing too, right? One rule for you and one rule for the rest of us. Right? Yeah. I didn't realize that. I mean, a lottery to get on a flight, for heaven's sake.
Oh yeah, I mean, the way you get back into New Zealand is like if you've been stranded abroad for 2 years, you stick your name in and they generate a number and they randomly generate a lottery. Meanwhile, if you're like some investor from Wall Street with $10 million, like, yeah, I bet you're not doing that crap.
Right. Well, you've just changed your citizenship to New Zealand, right? And built
exactly.
like your bunker into the side of the mountain. On that happy note.
On that happy note. No, I was going to say, so where do you want to end? We could end with the Chinese Olympics. They're coming up. You're a big Olympics fan, aren't you?
I do. I love the Olympics. I just saw that NBC is not sending their commentators, or they're sending, I think, one commentator over, but otherwise all the, the play-by-play will be done from the exciting town of Stamford, Connecticut. So, this Olympics is going to be, don't criticize the Chinese government because no one's going to be there to protect you if they disappear you, and no fans and zero COVID. So,
wow,
bring on that unity.
That's a fun one, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps it'll save us one thing, which, from the point of view as someone who's lived in the United States for 30 years, I'm a citizen, and all the rest of it, but I can't stand your Olympic coverage. It's the most saccharine, asinine bullshit. Every single person who's about to run, jump, ski, or fall in the face is somehow a hero. They've overcome adversity. It's the backstory. It's like they're a professional athlete. Can we let them get on with it, please? It's I can't watch it. Literally can't watch it. It's just literally turning it into like daytime soap.
Mark persevered over a childhood disability.
The one I
eyeballs.
remember, and it was great because it was the ultimate screw you to all this, was Bodie Miller. You remember Bodie Miller, right?
Skier,
So he was like, hot dog, the Top Gun, the whole thing. And it was, he's going to win 6 medals. No, he's going to win 8 medals. No, he's going to win 9 golds, right? And it was, I just had this picture of him sitting in his, wagon or whatever you're sitting in these things, just going, yeah, watch this, arseholes, as he basically just crashed out of a competition after competition. And the criticism rained down. And this was before you really had social media. And it was just like, he's just not trying. And it's like, what do you know? Why don't you try belting down a downhill course at 70 kilometres an hour on ice and tell me he's not trying? Just because you've built him up to be the best skier since Thor.
Yeah. No, one of the Olympic swimmers said it this summer. He's like, it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. I mean, some points were, but most of it was just really stressful and kind of awful. Yeah. And just the pressure on the athletes, is immense. But exactly your point. Like, you do, especially skiing when they crash. It's hard to watch because you just are imagining like how painful that is.
Oh, absolutely. And on that happy note of it's mainly strenuous and what was it? It's mainly, what was it? Mainly stressful and painful. That could be I think that could be the episode liner for this.
I really
episode.
like that. Happy New Year, mainly stressful and painful.
Yes, I think that's it.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.